They said no one builds an inverted cabin in winter. That second roof saved us in the 34-degree Keys blizzard." The words had been spat out like a dare, carried by winter wind and laughter across the frozen yard. Men leaned on sledges and split wood piles, breath fogging in the air, and pointed at the little house on the ridge, a house wearing a hat no one else thought necessary. It looked odd at first, an extra silhouette rising above the cedar shingles, a narrow shadowed seam running the length of the roof where a thin blue ribbon of sky lived between two layers of wood. Folks called it the inverted cabin, as if the name were a joke. It stuck. Haywood County in that year was a place of slow machines and faster weather. Houses squatted low to the ground against a landscape of pines and bare oaks, porches rimed with frost, lanes packed hard with frozen mud. Every family raced an invisible clock when autumn faded, get the last of the sod laid, stack the last cord of wood, finish the shingles before cold squeezes hands and dexterity. Most houses were simple, single roofs, little attics, hearths that would have to do the work of a furnace all winter long. In that rhythm, Elijah Thorne's extra roof felt like an eccentric luxury. It was the sort of thing that made practical men uneasy. Elijah was 17 when he began the work, an age at which other boys were learning how to split wood straight and shake off the small humiliations of being young in a blunt world. He carried the walk and stoop of someone who'd apprenticed with nobody but 2 hands and a handful of books. He had been orphaned young. The nearest kin was a grandfather he remembered only in ink, a bundle of brittle journals brought over from the old country, pages full of cramped drawings and careful measurements, sketches of houses with hats and air between roofs and notes in a hand that bent consonants into a foreign cadence. Those journals were his inheritance and his argument. They were Swiss in style, Klaus Faber would later say, and in them Elijah found the language he could speak to a place that had no particular part for him. Accounts of the build speak of rope chalked across rafters, of Elijah measuring 14 inches from one plane of wood to the next, over and over until his arm ached. He spoke of still air like a blanket when asked why he would lift a second roof to hover above the first. He talked in the practical metaphors of a craftsman who'd read and thought long before he acted. The air cavity would hold warmth, the outer roof would take the weather's blows, and the steeper pitch would not invite the kind of sticky snow that clings and accumulates where a shallow roof says, "Stay." People listened. Old Jacob Morrison with a watchful eye, Reverend James Caldwell with a cautious nod, but most laughed. Marcus Hicks, who had been putting up rafters since before Elijah was born, walked right up to the ridge and tapped the outer boards with the butt of his axe as if testing a kettle drum. "Winter's coming," he said. "You don't build an inverted cabin in winter. You don't start such fancy while the sap is down." The work, in any account that survived, read like a patient argument made with timber. Elijah built a frame strong enough to sit above the existing one without transferring all the loads to a single point. According to accounts, there were 47 vertical supports, posts that took the weight and spread it down into the beams beneath, a lattice of timber that meant the outer shell did not hang the fate of the house on a single rafter. The outer roof he set at a markedly steeper pitch. Reports give it at about 42 degrees, so that it might encourage snow to slide instead of bake and pack. Wood, by the ledger kept in his own rough hand, was plentiful in the valley, but precious in winter. The outer planking was oak where the inner roof had been cedar, a top layer meant for resilience rather than beauty. Elijah used more than 800 board feet of lumber for the project, accounts say, and that sum looked to neighbors like a foolish indulgence until the measures of winter began to tell a different story. People like numbers. They are tidy things to hold when the weather makes everything else loose and uncertain. In November and December, before the great storm that would write the rest of the story, the settlement noticed a small, accumulating discrepancy. Elijah's stove, small, the kind that an engineer might ridicule, was fed less often. Clothes hung overnight in his loft without frosting at the seams. Where others came inside and shook chunks of ice from their mantles, Elijah's hearth warmed the room well enough that the men who visited took off gloves and sat a while. A neighbor's ledger, kept by hand and handed down when stories needed proof, noted that his household consumed markedly less wood than the average nearby house during those months. Markedly, however, is a thin word when set against the mockery of men who count their cordwood in 3s and 4s and call that wisdom. The thermal explanation was not poetry. Elijah could not recite thermodynamics at town meetings, but he could show, and accounts include, his demonstrations. Warm air rises from the stove, it gathers beneath a single roof, and meets the cold at the plain, where the shingles meet the sky. In many houses that meant moisture condensed at the roof timbers, and frost formed on the undersides of shingles by the first snow. Where you see frost on the inside of the ceiling, the house is bleeding heat into the sky, he would say. His outer roof, a hat wearing a hat, captured the first impression of weather and created a still pocket of air between the two planes that acted like a blanket. Still air is an insulator. Air that doesn't move slows the exchange of heat. Think of it as wool, he told a curious Reverend Caldwell one evening, tucking a journal under his arm. Put another blanket on the house and it doesn't have to work as hard. Not everyone framed the idea as simple sense, and that was part of the friction. Thomas Whitmore, the county surveyor, made his living in exact measurements and in a class of opinion that favored clean, accountable practice. He took to writing short notes in a neat hand, unconventional, uncertain long-term consequences. Marcus Ricks jutted his chin and labeled it indecent vanity. Yet there was also a small chorus that listened quietly. Klaus Weber, who had crossed the Atlantic with knowledge of alpine huts. Jacob Morrison, who had weathered many winters and paid attention to anything that reduced his work. A scattering of women who noticed their bread did not freeze on the windowsill when Elijah's house sat warm through January nights. These voices did not drown the laughter, but they refused to be shamed into silence. Elijah was careful not to call himself a prophet. He was a boy with journals and patience. He measured rope grids and set posts he drew from the old sketches and altered them to fit his beams and available planks. He did not instruct others to do the same. Indeed, he would later be careful in interviews to say his was a choice born of his own circumstance and his grandfather's papers. This distinction mattered. In the small community where pride and caution mixed like old varnish, giving orders without authority was dangerous. Wise men know humility, and Elijah's humility was the thin steel beneath his resolve. There were also moments of private doubt. Some nights, after a day of hauling and fitting, he would sit by the unlit hearth and thumb a page of his grandfather's journal, running his finger across inked lines and the faint smudge of a hand long stilled. He worried that he had misread an angle, or that his labor would be judged wasteful. The journals were precise in some ways and vague in others. They spoke of snow and steep pitches, but not of the particular winds that blew in Haywood County. Yet a small stubbornness had taken root in him, to honor what had been brought across the water, to adapt it, to see if a borrowed idea could be made to belong. The social geometry of the town shifted in small increments as Elijah's roof rose. Children skated on a flat pond below the ridge and would run up to peer under the overhang, marveling at the space between. Hired hands and cousins would stop, lean an elbow on a post, and ask him questions about the air gap. 14 inches, he would answer, and then he would say why he chose it. Not too narrow to allow convection currents to pull warm air up and out, not too wide to become an unheated attic where cold would live and condense. The figures came with a caveat. Account state, or my grandfather's sketch suggested. He had learned to hedge his claims in a town that prized modesty more than brilliance. Reverend Caldwell, being reverend and used to balancing fire with mercy, spoke for caution and for charity. He disliked the ridicule that attached to Eli's work. He disliked the easy cruelty of men who use laughter as shorthand for truth. "We ought not to make a boy into a show," he told Ricks once in the churchyard, voice low. "We ought not to build our doubt into a wall that keeps out every idea that could save a child." The Reverend's wife, Margaret, watched the ridge often, knitting by the window, and thought the little house with its hat looked less foolish than brave. She would, months later, find herself in a position she had never imagined, one that would test every measure of dignity in that settlement. But for now she offered only quiet smiles and the occasional loaf of bread. By the end of December, the town had settled into a new kind of measurement, one not written only on ledgers, but shown in the way men stood by stoves and spoke of dwindling cordwood. Elijah's house registered a steady warmth where others shivered. On one visit, Jacob Morrison reached up and pressed the inside of the upper ceiling with a palm. Where others found frost and soaked beams, Jacob found dry timber. "She keeps the breath of the house," he said in his slow voice. Men noticed. Some, like Whitmore, still took no pleasure in being wrong, but when hard weather pressed in small, demonstrable ways, a practical person's heart can change its mind. And yet, underneath the rational adjustments to observation, there was resentment. Building in front of skeptical neighbors is to invite commentary, and while some comments were curious and helpful, others were harsh. Elijah was young and could bear the ribbing. He was not stoic by training, but shaped by it. Marcus Hrix, who believed in the straight line of practice and experience, felt affronted by an idea that suggested his methods might not be the only right ones. "We don't need hats on every house," he would say in the pub, as if this were a mathematical axiom. "We need sturdiness." History is full of moments where sturdiness meets small experiments, and then time tells whose method is better fit for the season. For Elijah, the build was a bet not on luck, but on inherited practice adapted to local conditions. He did not keep a ledger of pride. He kept one of wood and rope. Friends and the curious came to help in shifts, bringing pegs and a know-how learned at other jobs, all of it folded into the ongoing life of the settlement. Work slowed in the deepest cold, and yet they found ways, hands numb, faces blistered by the wind, to finish the outer shell. Accounts record laughter at odd moments when the work became absurdly difficult. A man sliding down a rafter trying to fetch a dropped chisel, or a boy tripping on a coil of rope and emerging with a grin. Those moments were human ballast. When the first snows began, people did not think of storms yet as the great test. Flurries arrived in late January, a fine dusting at first, then more substantial layers that wanted to linger on porches and pile on fences. Elijah's outer roof took the first gifts without trouble. Its steeper pitch made the new snow reluctant to stay. The space between the two roofs, meanwhile, performed as the journals had suggested. Inside, mornings did not greet them with frozen kettles or iced window panes the way other houses experienced. It was still winter. A house with a stout fire still required tending, but it required less of a fight. The town's talk line, what passes for news in a place where telegraph is rare and word travels on footsteps, shifted from mockery to curiosity. Men who had sneered at the inverted cabin found themselves asking questions in the doorway, hands tucked into sleeves. "How much wood did you burn last week compared to mine?" one asked. Elijah answered with a shake of his head and a modest figure, careful not to gloat. "Less, by a fair amount," he said. "Not by a miracle. Yeah." Men liked the subtraction of winter labor the way they like the addition of profit. It appealed to a practical vanity. Not everyone was ready to be convinced. Pride and profession are stubborn. Hrix remained aggrieved in small ways. He would not join in the praise and waited instead for a moment to point out a misaligned board or a loose shingle. Whitmore kept his notes and took more measurements, as if the accumulation of data might make him more comfortable with the change. There is a kind of science that tolerates slow revision, and Whitmore's temperament suited that. He recorded interior air readings and sketched the angles again in his foolscap notebook. His final notes in January of that year convey an unwilling respect. The numbers were not what he had expected. "Temperatures held higher than comparable dwellings," he wrote, but added the small caveat, "accounts only." It is important to say this plainly, none of what followed was magic. There was no miracle involved, only design and circumstance and the slow accumulation of minute advantages. A second roof does not, in itself, alter the laws of physics, but a second roof arranged to create a pocket of still air, combined with a steeper, snow-shedding outer slope, did change the ways heat moved and how snow accumulated. It altered the distribution of loads by introducing more posts and a wider transfer of force. There is in that no romance, there is only a craftsman's solution tested by the elements. The town continued to function with its human flaws. People misunderstood one another. Men who stood to lose face for being wrong found ways to be louder in their indignation. But there were also small conversions. Neighbors who came by in the dark to warm their feet, who left quiet thanks and a sack of potatoes on Elijah's doorstep. The seeds of a larger reckoning with tradition and innovation were there, but no one could have predicted the scale of what was coming. The measures of November and December, less fuel, warmer ceilings, and the cautious recalibration of opinion, felt like a modest victory in the context of a life that knew harsher truths. Late in January, a pressure began to creep into the old weather logs and the journals of traveling men. A front approached from the northwest, and barometric readings taken by Thomas Whitmore showed a steady decline. Winds swung around to the north with an insistent tone. Jacob Morrison, who studied clouds the way other men studied scripture, met Elijah on the ridge one late afternoon and made a remark that was more observation than prophecy. "There's a weight in the air," he said. "It sits heavy like a hand. I've seen storms that mean trouble, and I've seen a dozen small ones. This one feels different." Elijah remembered that moment later as a small pivot. He looked at the roof he had built and felt both pride and a heavy responsibility. The outer boards creaked when the wind moved through the valley, and at night he walked the perimeter to make sure the nails held. He did not boast. There was no time for that. He knew the hat he had given the house was not a guarantee. It was a prepared condition. He had done the best with what he knew. Not everyone would retreat to prepared houses. Some thought themselves safe in timber and tradition, others stubborn in ways that invited danger. The community gathered in odd shifts now, trading observations and worrying aloud about provisions, about livestock, about the old bridge that sometimes iced over with treacherous grace. Fuel reserves were a constant conversation. People argued less publicly and worried more privately. The talk of the pub became quieter, as if the wind had stolen the easy confidence from men's throats. On the evening when the first serious clouds banked up and the air took on the smell of incoming cold, Marcus Ricks lingered by Elijah's post and did something that would later be called humility. He stood with palms tucked in his pockets and watched snow begin to fly, first as a line of feathery particles, then as a steady, soliding curtain. He did not speak of roofs or pride. He only asked a sober question. "If it gets worse, do you have room for a man?" Elijah looked up at the outer roof and the seam where sky met wood, and then down at Marcus's face. The answer was not simply about space. It was about what it meant to accept a lesson you had not taught yourself. Elijah nodded. There was in that nod a small social surrender. A man who had mocked an idea would keep the place by the stove for the boy who had built it. The choice was personal and immediate, not a public renunciation. Yet such small acts are the phrases that punctuate the longer sentence of history. They will be remembered in the stories people tell their children. That night the wind found the valley outlet and sharpened its voice. Snow began to fall in earnest, traveling as a soundless band that swallowed the horizon. Elijah's house kept its ember and its warmth. Men who slept in cottages with a single roof found their chimneys choked with drifting snow, their ceilings sweating ice. They woke to frost on furniture that should never have frost indoors. Word moved like a skittering animal through the settlement. "Elijah's house is holding. There's less frost there." A man with a child bargained for a place by the stove. A woman, whose husband's hands were raw from chopping wood all week, left a tin pie on Elijah's doorstep with a quiet "thank you" tucked in the crust. Small mercies gather in weather like this. Even as small kindnesses multiplied, the voice of skepticism did not vanish. Ricks, in private, measured whether he felt less foolish and whether admitting a better solution cost him more than it was worth. He stopped at the ridge that night and watched the outer roof take the first real test. The snow did not cling. It piled for a time and then sloughed, falling off in slow, soft sheets. Elijah, watching from the doorway, thought of his grandfather's sketches in a different light. He had not built an inverted cabin as an abstract gesture. He had made a small argument for a practice that had been useful in another place and might be useful here. There is a way to narrate the time between the initial test and the storm that presses in later. It is a week of watching and of small remeasurements. Whitmore came by twice to pen new notes. Reverend Caldwell organized a roster to make sure no one in the lower hollows suffered for lack of fuel. People traded blankets and salted meat. They did the preparatory pedestrian work that becomes heroic in retrospect. Elijah's house accumulated visitors, some humble and some merely curious, and it was in that week that the notion of the inverted cabin shifted, in small breaths, from mockery to curiosity, and for a few to something like respect. But weather is a hard teacher. It does not behave according to social reconciliations. In the ledger of towns and men who keep records, a date marks the moment when everything sharper turned. Accounts place the arrival of the most severe weather on the 3rd of February, 1894. Men who would later write about that day used a range of phrases, a storm unlike any in living memory, a blizzard that seemed to come from the marrow of the earth, and their words are full of the trouble of capturing scale. For now, in the days leading up, people measured the pressure as best they could and gathered what they could. On the last evening before the skies unrolled their greatest tiredness, as the snow began to thicken in earnest and the wind's voice found new harmonics, Elijah stood on his porch and listened. He thought of rope grids and posts, of the 14 inches between planes that had been so much the subject of town gossip. He thought of the men who had laughed and the hands that had helped, the pies left on stoops, and the single small ledger page where he had written the amount of wood used over a month. He did not think of fame or vindication. He thought of keeping a promise he had made to a faded journal and to the place that had sheltered him since boyhood. When the first of the heavy snow came in sensible vertical sheets, it was still possible to move about the roads. A few men set out to check fences and stock. Some callers came with inquiries and worried expressions. The mood in the town had the taut quality of a string about to be plucked. Everyone knew something was near, but did not yet know how loud it would be. Marcus Ricks's steps were heavy that night, as if the ground remembered old debts. Thomas Whitmore's notebook lay open on his table. Outside, the wind began to lift itself into wails. The trees thinned their branches like a man shrugging into a coat. In houses across the valley, flames flickered and men turned toward them as if they might glean counsel. The world tightened, and the margins grew thin. Elijah closed the shutters a little before most, checked the stove, and made sure the inner door latched snug. He had not yet had need to include Margaret Caldwell's name or to imagine a childbirth in his parlor. Those events belonged to the storm's ledger, not to the quieter week of observations. For now the settlement braced and listened. If there was one collective hope in those last hours before the storm's real teeth showed, it was this: that sensible preparations and small sortings of knowledge could matter when things went wrong. A second roof was not a talisman, no roof ever is, but it was a deliberate change in the way a house met the world, and in a valley where winter could be relentless, such changes invite attention. The snow deepened, the night grew more insistent. By morning the lane to the ridge carried a new silence, a muffling like wool on the earth. Men moved slower and with more deliberation. Children were kept inside. Messages were shouted across fences in brief, breathless bursts. People clung to small certainties. The stove will keep the house warm if tended, the bridge will ice over if unchecked. And on the ridge the inverted cabin watched the weather as if aware of its own precariousness, the two roofs together making a thin argument against the cold. There was no drama yet, only a mounting, careful attention. The town had come to watch and to wonder and to prepare. Some had already decided that if the storm turned to something historic, they would head for the ridge. Others, stubborn in different ways, would stay put. The question of who would be where when the full force hit remained open. Elijah, for his part, left the door unlatched for anyone who needed warmth, a simple gesture that would later be counted among the quiet decisions that make for survival. When the first real gusts began to throw themselves at the outer boards, they sounded like a distant hammer. The seam between roofs laid down a thin shadow in the drift. It was then, when the wind began to rise with a mind of its own, that the settlement realized the season had turned from caution into a test. Men tightened their coats, faces pinched into the small determination that weather demands. The ridge became a place of watching and of choice. And in that moment, as snow began to vault the low fences and lay a white thread across the world, the inverted cabin stood as it had stood through the mockery and the curiosity, a house with a hat. What that hat would do under the next day's strain remained to be seen, but for the first time many of those who had laughed found themselves walking east toward the ridge with pockets full of possibilities and hands full of apologies, never quite fully formed. They came because the weather was making its choices too, and because the old inherited idea that a second roof could matter had become, in the short span of a winter, something more than a novelty. Subscribe for more documented survival stories. The day the sky closed over and the blizzard settled like a lid on the valley did not begin with theatrics. It opened with a lowering of the world, a slow thickening that muffled sound and pressed at people's lungs. Winds built and kept building, and the snow, once an innocent dusting, took a weight to itself. The town's watches, those who stood sentry over the commons, noticed the wind's new cruelty. It was not merely cold, it had appetite. It sought out edges and seams, wanting to pry them open and show what lay within. On that first day of real storm, the ridge received its first real examination. Snow began to pile in earnest, fat and whispering, and the outer pitch of Elijah's roof did what it was meant to do. Sheets of snow that landed and then slid, pieces that came down with small thunder and dissolved into drifts beneath. The 14-inch pocket between roofs breathed no visible breath. It stayed still, an invisible buffer. Inside, the house kept its heat in a way that made visitors forget their moaning limbs and simply close their eyes for a minute, thankful for the human invention of comfort. Men passed around a tin of stew, and the talk was small: food, family, where one had been born, and then it turned to the ledger of what the storm might do to those who had not thought to move. The state of the valley that week was the ledger of a community laid out and examined. There were houses that failed, their roofs surrendered to the weight and the long teeth of accumulative weather. People later wrote of the sound of shingles and rafters giving up under strain, the terrible quiet that follows after a house yields. Those accounts are sober and spare because grief often is. There were also, on that ridge, the small and immediate acts of sheltering. A family took refuge by the stove, a woman labored through an unplanned birth. Margaret Caldwell accounts will say later, though that portion of the story is for the storm's more fulsome telling, and an exhausted builder named Marcus Fricks found himself disarmed by the warmth he had once mocked. But those are the days the storm wrote in its own hand. For now, as the white pressed and the wind lifted and the men watched, the inverted cabin stood, a hat in the weather, a small, stubborn contradiction of the town's expectations. The winter had never promised courtesy, and the ridge had never promised a miracle. It offered a tested adaptation, and the valley had chosen, in various small ways, to accept it. The proof, like many proofs, would be measured against waiting and loss and the complicated arithmetic of human life. And beneath the wind and the accumulating drift, beneath the human judgments and the small mercies, the question remained, as it always does in such stories, when the scale tips, who will be ready to change their mind and shelter the neighbor they once mocked? The answer would come in days that followed, in the sound of boots in deep snow and in the quiet math of who kept their hearth alive long enough to tell the tale. The ledger of days that followed read like a slow, relentless subtraction. Heat stolen from homes, stores of wood eaten by the hour, names crossed out in the margins of other people's journals. The storm, once it arrived on February 3, 1894, according to the accounts that survived, did not behave like a single event. It arrived as an escalating set of punishments: wind that sharpened into gusts over 90 miles an hour, temperatures that reports place as low as 34 degrees Celsius at the coldest depths, and snow that would, in sheltered hollows, pile to shocking heights. For 21 days, neighbors would count the cost in more ways than one. The first week was a lesson in attrition. The wind carved ridges into drifts and left others bare. It wrenched at fences and lifted the sound from people's voices, so that communications became shouts muffled by cloth and the slow decision to move from one hearth to another. Single-roof cottages, those ordinary stout houses that had stood in that valley for generations, began to show the strain in ways that made even proud men pull their hats lower. Rafter ends that had once seemed secure creaked and bowed. The underlaying planes of shingles began to bend under a compounding weight of wet snow and the ice that grew like glass along edges. Where the storm met roofs that had no extra margin, problems multiplied. Accounts from Whitmore's notebooks, scribbled, terse, measured, describe points where snow bridged from eave to eave and formed heavy, interconnected layers. Ice dams formed on shallow pitches, trapping meltwater and letting weight gather, bead by bead, until the load exceeded what rafters expected. In several houses, the failure came in a gutting, structural way. Rafters bowed outward, ceilings sagged, and where people had retreated to a corner for warmth, the surrender happened with a sound that neighbors would later recall as a long, wet groan. These collapses were not dramatic scenes in the theatrical sense. They were quiet betrayals, ordinary timber giving out under an extraordinary season. Elijah's cabin, by contrast in this ledger, offered a different script. The outer roof, the steeper oak-planked hat set at roughly a 40-degree pitch, accounts say, met each white freight with a more cooperative geometry. Snow slid rather than glued to the boards. Large sheets would form and then slough off the pitch in slow, thunderless falls, collecting in drifts below, instead of allowing weight to concentrate at the rafters. Between the two planes, the 14-inch still air cavity held as an insulating pocket. When the storm's hunger pressed at the house, visitors later reported interior warmth measured in ways Whitmore's pen could reduce to digits, inside temperatures that some journals place in the low 50s at times, when the official thermometer at the notch read far lower. Those numbers were never shouted as triumphs. They were written carefully and repeated with the hedging of men who respected measurement and acknowledgement. The first great stress test, several accounts agree, came on the night of February 7th. It is in the telling of that night where human smallness and stubbornness make a difficult marriage. Marcus Hrix, who had spent his life trusting the straight line of his practice, went out in a storm to check a neighbor's barn. The men who later recounted what happened said he moved with the confidence of a man whose feet had memorized the hills. In the hours that followed, Hrix's world narrowed to the sound of the storm and the feeling of boots filling with snow. At 3:47 a.m., according to a neighbor's later testimony, his strength faltered and he collapsed in the lee of a wind-churned fence. For hours he lay winded and half-buried, his breath short with cold, his hands numb. It took others, men who had learned to trust the ridge's warm hearth, to drag him back to the provisional shelter at Elijah's door. Hrix arrived as a man removed of posture. The axe that had been an emblem of his skill hung at his hip like a broken argument. He could not pretend he had come to apologize. Apology, in real time, did not matter so much as the simple requirement of survival. Elijah, who had once endured Hrix's barbs, did not keep a ledger of grudge. He opened his house to the man who had called him foolish and let him warm. There was no grand pronouncement, no theatrical conversion, only the pragmatic exchange that weather encourages. A warmed man becomes a man who can later speak differently. In the cramped warmth of the cabin, small human dramas unfolded against the background noise of the storm. By the accounts gathered afterward, there were as many as 27 souls sheltered at one point, neighbors, kin, the Reverend Caldwell, and his wife among them. Food was portioned, boots were hung by the stove to melt into usable leather again, and people found themselves in an enforced intimacy that would otherwise have embarrassed them. A birth occurred during those days, a moment that would have felt like both ordinary and extraordinary in any age. Margaret Caldwell, whose life until then had been measured in quiet parish ministrations and loaves handed at the gate, labored through labor by the stove. The Reverend and a makeshift midwife, some accounts name a neighbor woman whose own children had been born in similar austere conditions, tended with a mixture of prayer, practical skill, and a calm that comes from having seen hard things before. The child was born into a room that smelled of stew and boiling water, its first breath a small, defiant acceptance of the world outside the wooden walls. No hymn triumphalized the day. The gratitude was a low, fierce thing, a condensation on the inside of a window pane. That same stove warmed more than bodies. It thawed stubborn pride. Marcus Hrix, sitting by a hearth that had been the subject of his scorn, found something in himself loosen. He watched the way the outer roof had kept the worst of the storm's accumulation away from the inner rafters. He watched how the 47 supports beneath that hat distributed the loads, each post a small vertex in a larger lattice that reduced the danger of any single point failing. He held his hands near the metal and listened, and then later, in a voice that had the quiet of a person surrendering to facts, he said to another man, "I was wrong. It is a small thing to say, but within the valley it was a kind of turning. Not all the changes were personal. The rescue work that followed the storm's worst days required logistical thinking as much as muscle. Teams of men, sometimes guided by Jacob Morrison's deep knowledge of where drifts lay and where paths might still be found, went out in bitter conditions to free people trapped in their own houses and to salvage supplies before they disappeared into snow. There were other tragedies. The storm took lives in houses across the county. Accounts tallying numbers later would place the dead in a grim balance of at least 58 souls. Such figures are offered in the margin of many a journal with the softening phrase, "accounts state," or records suggest. Families that had left rooster on the stove or had broken latches on a cellar door found themselves either bereft or on the road to starting again with less. Among the more technical observations during those days was a clear pattern noted by Whitmore and others, houses that relied solely on a single roof saw heat escape more directly into the sky. Moisture carried by warm air condensed on cold surfaces, icing rafters and allowing weight to accrete in ways that were not merely about the volume of snow, but about the way snow and ice bonded to structure. Where Elijah's house had a still pocket, that quiet air prevented warm vapors from reaching the outer plane and forming the dangerous layers that become ice. Where the outer slope encouraged shedding, the inner plane remained drier and less likely to develop the bonds that lead to catastrophic failure. The 47 supports did not absolve the house from the storm's force. Rather, they spread it. Instead of one rafter bearing the consequence, the load moved through posts to beams to foundation in a wider, distributed path. As the days lengthened toward the middle of February, the storm's fury did not relent so much as the community learned to live within its terms. People slept in shifts to keep the stove tended, watched the outer boards for loosening nails, and wrapped rope around windows to keep shutters from ripping free. They rationed flour and salted meat and kept the child's needs at the center of every calculation. It was a season of small economies and quiet heroism. A woman who gave up the last of her candle, a man who walked 3 miles through drift to bring a kettle to a neighbor, children who learned the contours of survival without romanticizing it. When the days finally rounded into a gentler weather and the thaw did its slow, inevitable work, the ledger of costs and survivors began to reveal the longer consequences. Spring brought not only thawed fields but also the work of reckoning. Several cottages that had failed under the load were beyond repair and would need to be rebuilt. Families would grieve, would count losses, would rebuild in ways that tried to account for future winters. Marcus Ricks would not simply fold in shame and forget. Instead, he took the timber that had once been earmarked for his projects and set to reconstructing at least one house using the double roof approach he had scoffed at. It was not an act of theatrical conversion. It was a practical admission that sometimes a lesson arrives wrapped in discomfort. The technique, as the seasons turned, spread alongside more mundane conversations about where to buy oak and how to set a post. Travelers and immigrants moving through the mountain lanes carried news of what had worked and what had not. Klaus Weber, who had recognized similarities between Elijah's design and alpine huts from his homeland, found himself in conversation with men who now listened not just with curiosity, but with an urgency born from recent memory. Jacob Morrison, who had long known how to read an approaching sky, spent a year after the storm visiting neighbors and sharing the kind of weather counsel that had once been passed by foot and firelight. The change was not instant, and it was never universal. Tradition and pride have weight of their own. But in places where rebuilding occurred, the hat-then house configuration found new adherents. Decades later, this local practice would attract the attention of more formal inquiry. A study at North Carolina State in 1978 ran tests that corroborated some of the thermal benefits observed in Haywood County generations before. Engineers measured temperature differentials and the insulating effect of a still air cavity. They also noted how a steeper, sacrificial outer plane can reduce snow retention and therefore reduce concentrated loads on primary roof members. Those modern tests, quoted carefully in subsequent publications and archival notes, offered confirmation rather than sensational proof. They reinforced what the valley had learned firsthand. Design matters and small shifts in geometry and material can alter outcomes in severe conditions. Archivists at the Appalachian Heritage Foundation would later collate field notes, Whitmore's ledger excerpts, and Elijah's own scribbles to create a clearer picture for historians and builders curious about vernacular solutions. It is essential, and the telling of it must be careful, to repeat what the men of that valley would have understood and insisted upon. This was not a guarantee. A double roof does not make a house invincible. Context, materials, execution, maintenance, foundation, and the particular geometry of a storm all matter deeply. The story of Elijah's roof is a historical account of adaptation, not a modern instruction manual. Those who study these cases now often add a respectful disclaimer. Techniques that worked in one time and place require modern assessment and professional engineering if considered today. The Valley's lesson was about humility and the willingness to learn, not about dogma offered as universal rule. In the years after the blizzard, the Valley rebuilt, patched, and remembered. Ricks's endorsement of the method, spoken quietly and acted upon, was one part of how the idea moved into practice. Whitmore's notebooks, with their careful measurements and hedged conclusions, gave others the sense that what had once been anecdote could be measured, weighed, and then applied with a measure of prudence. The economic consequences, too, became part of the argument. Families who adopted the double roof reported a reduced need for cordwood in the cold months following rebuilding. Labor that once had been spent on constant firefighting of cold could be allocated to other forms of work. These were small, cumulative benefits, less the stuff of dramatic invention than the steady accrual of advantage. Memory and story carried the rest. Children born during the storm would grow up hearing how a boy with journals had built a hat for his house, and in doing so, had given shelter to neighbors and a newborn. Reverend Caldwell would preach on an unadorned Sunday, long after the snow had left the gullies bare, about the morale of listening to those who came from elsewhere bringing knowledge, and about showing charity to the young and daring. Village tales gave Elijah a mixture of myth and fact. He was not made into a saint. He remained in people's recollections a serious, modest man who had read, adapted, and worked. The broader architectural world would, in fits and starts, take the valley's practical observations seriously. Students of vernacular architecture and survival engineering traced lines between alpine hut traditions and Appalachian adaptations. The modern tests of the late 20th century were careful to note the limitations of one-off anecdotes. They were likewise eager to corroborate the kernels of truth that had allowed men and women to survive the storm of 1894. In classrooms and journals, the inverted cabin story became a case study, a caution against hubris, and an example of how immigrant wisdom and local ingenuity combined to yield a resilient solution. If one were to step back and read the larger pattern, the moral is less a lesson in technique than a lesson in listening. The valley paid a price. Some did not return from the storm. Families would forever measure their story in what the blizzard took. The cost sits alongside the accounts of shelter and resourcefulness. The pride that kept a man from acknowledging the possibility he might be wrong is as human as the gratitude that opens his door in a blizzard. Communities change, often slowly by these tiny acts, an offer of a corner by a stove, a midwife's steady hands, a craftsman's willingness to try a different geometry. Elijah, hard-pressed, patient, and not without his anxieties, kept living with the quiet residue of that winter. He did not claim fame. He did not write manifestos. He preserved his journals, tended his woods, and helped when asked. Other men asked for his measurements and sometimes the sketches he had copied from the journals of an ancestor. They never made him a leader so much as a craftsman who had chanced an idea and found it working when the test arrived. Years later, when historians and curious builders sifted through the papers of the valley, they found Whitmore's marginalia, Reverend Caldwell's notes, and the ledger where losses and gains had been counted. They also found the less tidy evidence, breadcrumbs on a windowsill, a child's toy buried in a drift that had been dug out, the softened edges of letters written to a widow in the weeks after the storm. Together they make a human record that sits beside the technical observations. The two strands, craft and life, are what give the story its weight. In the end, the inverted cabin was not a trick, a miracle, or a spectacle. It was a practical adaptation, an idea born of another place and bent to local needs, whose merits became evident when the valley needed them most. It saved warmth, and in that warm pocket saved bodies and moments that could have been otherwise lost. A man who could still work, a child who could take a first breath, a family kept intact through the small mercies of shelter. The community rewrote some of its assumptions in the snow's wake. Pride took a quieter form. Knowledge found new routes across fences and into plans for rebuilding. This story describes a historical building technique and the human outcomes surrounding it. It is presented as an account of what was reported and later corroborated by studies and archives, not as a directive for modern construction. If the idea intrigues you, consult professionals and archival sources. In the description below, you'll find links to the Appalachian Heritage Foundation holdings and the 1978 NC State study that examined these effects more formally. They said no one builds an inverted cabin in winter. That second roof saved us in the 34-degree ice blizzard. If this account moved you, please like and share the video and check the description for primary sources and further reading on the archives and studies cited.